What if the purest love you've ever felt were also the seed of your destruction? What if the person who once held your hand with tenderness returned years later carrying the cold of death in their eyes? What if the past we insist on burying had enough strength to open its own grave and walk toward us, demanding answers we no longer know how to give? I've always wondered how much of what we lived remains truly alive. Even after we believe we've moved on, some memories behave like echoes. They don't disappear, they only drift far enough for us to think we're free, until they return, deeper, more insistent. And what if what we tried to forget doesn't actually want to be forgotten? What if our entire destiny revolved around a single choice made long before we understood its consequences? These questions began haunting me on one of those quiet days when even the light seems to hesitate before touching the ground. It was as if the entire world whispered the same warning. Something is waiting for you. Something ancient, like promises murmured at the edge of a creek. Something dark, like a name written at midnight and buried beneath a tree that never blooms. I always thought the past was just a place inside memory, but I learned it is also a door that can open without warning. And when it opens, it's useless to pretend we don't hear the groan of its rusted hinges. And what if that door were about to open right now? With that feeling dense, almost physical, the narrative of my life began to shift, as if each step echoed through invisible corridors, guiding me toward a fate I never sought, but that always waited for me. And yet, before anything could begin, I needed to return to that place. The forgotten mansion on top of the hill where my first love had lived, and where many believe he never truly left. It felt strange to think about it after so many years. The pain no longer throbbed as it once had, but it remained dormant, like embers hidden beneath cold ashes. What if those embers were about to reignite? What if the wind that awakens them was already on its way? As those questions coiled through my thoughts, I realized there was no point in running. The story I once believed ended was beginning again. And this time, something told me I wouldn't merely witness the events, I would be their target. With that dark awareness, I took a deep breath and allowed the shift to take place within me. Like someone crossing a forbidden threshold, I took my first steps back into the past, and when I finally touched the handle of that forgotten door, the narrative changed tone. Darkness, at last, welcomed me. The mansion rose before me like a monolith surviving time. Its walls were covered in ancient ivy, so thick it seemed to suffocate the structure, as if nature itself wished to conceal the place. The building was tall, with narrow windows jutting outward like eyes that never sleep. The twilight cast long shadows stretching across the winding road until they reached my feet, inviting me inside or warning me to turn back. The air there always had a particular scent, a mix of damp wood, decaying leaves, and something undefinable, like distilled memories turned into perfume. The aroma struck me with the force of an unavoidable remembrance. I couldn't help but think of him, my first love, in a time so distant it felt almost unreal. Our bond was born there, within walls heavy with secrets. I remember the soft glow of old lamps reflecting off family portraits that lined the main hallway. Stern faces, rigid poses, paintings that seemed to follow anyone who dared walk beneath their silent gaze. I grew up hearing stories about the mansion curses, broken promises, inexplicable disappearances. But even so, it was there I experienced my first moments of true tenderness, and now I had returned, without truly knowing why. Come back, he needs you. There was no signature, but I recognized the handwriting. I would have recognized it among a million others. It was his, the one I believed dead. Logic said it was impossible, but my restless heart whispered otherwise. As I ascended the hill, the feeling that something was profoundly wrong intensified. Everything looked the same, yet something felt subtly displaced, as if objects were a few centimeters off, as if time had passed differently there. The mansion seemed alive, breathing, watching my every move. Crossing the rusted gate, a sharp creak echoed like a warning. The wind turned colder. The trees leaned subtly inward, forming a natural corridor leading to the main door. It was impossible to ignore the thought that the environment was reacting to my presence. Inside, I walked slowly, touching the furniture coated in thin dust, as if each inch revealed a piece of the history I had tried to forget. The floor groaned beneath me, the sound echoing like old laments. Light filtered through the windows, forming beams that intertwined with floating particles, like tiny ghosts reluctant to disappear. Memories returned, some sweet, others painful. My first love, the deepest, the most unforgettable, the love that supposedly died before it could bloom. Yet there I was, holding a letter written in his hand. The unease grew when I noticed something on the floor of the main hall, thin marks, like recent scratches, forming lines that extended toward the upper staircase. I followed them with my eyes. Step by step, they climbed into the darkness of the second floor. A shiver ran down my spine. Something was in that house, something that did not want to remain hidden. In that moment, I realized the return wasn't a choice, it was inevitable. The past had summoned me, and I had already answered. For a moment, everything felt too silent. The quick movement at the top of the stairs might have been an illusion, a trick of the light filtering through the high windows and the suspended dust. But the sensation that settled over me was not an illusion, it had weight, temperature. It was the unsettling awareness of being watched. Helena, the protagonist, stayed still at the base of the stairs, her heart beating out of rhythm with the quiet around her. There was no wind inside the mansion, yet a cold current slid down the banister as if the air itself was seeping toward her. She inhaled deeply, trying to organize her thoughts, as if arranging memories in old drawers. It was strange to realize that, even after all these years, that place still knew how to touch the most vulnerable parts of her memory. She forced herself to climb step by step. The wooden boards creaked under her feet in regular intervals, like a clock marking each step back into the past. The walls of the upper corridor were covered with the same portraits she remembered. Rigid figures, ancestors with unreadable gazes, faces that had never known a smile. In her youth, Helena used to imagine stories for each of them. Now she felt as if they imagined stories about her. Stories that perhaps already knew the ending. At the top of the stairs, she found nothing but long shadows shaped by the soft light from a side window. No figure, no movement, no concrete sign that anything had been there. Only a silent hallway, doors closed on both sides, like mouths sealed around secrets unwilling to be spoken. The mansion didn't seem abandoned in the usual sense. There was dust, yes, but not enough for so many years of neglect. Some furniture looked recently moved, leaving light scratches on the floor. On a side table, a half-melted candle had a darkened wick, as if extinguished not long ago. Helena absorbed these details like small thorns piercing the skin of reality, suggesting that someone or something had been moving through the house. She walked down the hallway until she reached a door she knew well. The room where many afternoons had been spent between books, distant music, and shy confessions. The room where her first love, Raphael, used to hide from the world and from himself. The room where, once, he had given her an object she never forgot, a darkened metal pendant with a strange symbol engraved in the center. Back then, he said it represented a promise. And although many things had faded from her memory, the feeling of that moment remained vivid. Helena pushed the door, which opened with a long groan, like an old sigh. The room was a mosaic of overlapping times. The furniture remained mostly in its old positions, but there were signs of recent use. A slightly open drawer, a wrinkled blanket at the corner of the bed, a book left face down on the desk, its pages spread as if the reader intended to return within minutes. The room smelled of faint mold, mixed with something familiar, almost inter-matter fragrance she recognized instantly. The soft scent Raphael used to leave behind as he passed. There was no way that aroma could have survived on its own for years. The conclusion washed over her like cold tide. Someone had been there, recently, and in a disturbingly familiar way. The window was ajar, letting in a thin line of wind that made the curtain tremble. Outside, the hill stretched toward the small town Billafog Valley, wrapped in its usual melancholic aura, a place where time seemed to move too slowly. People aged with quiet resignation. Stories spread in whispers, especially stories about the mansion on the hill and the boy who, years ago, allegedly died tragically, leaving behind a girl forever changed. Helena shifted her gaze back inside. On the desk, beside the open book, lay something that had never been there before, a photograph. She approached cautiously, as if simply looking at it might awaken dormant forces. It was an old photo, yellowed at the edges, showing young Helena beside Raphael in front of the mansion. Both smiled at someone beyond the frame, perhaps a family member or a friend. The disturbing detail wasn't her presence in the picture, but the fact she didn't remember that moment at all. That smile, that pose, those clothes, none of it felt familiar. A sense of displacement settled in, as if there were holes in her memory, as if pieces of her life had been torn out and replaced with fragments that didn't fit. Then she noticed something else in the photo. Behind her younger self and Raphael, near a second-floor window of the mansion, a faint figure appeared. Tall, thin, almost fused with the shadow. At first glance, it could have been a flaw in the image, a stray reflection. But the longer Helena looked at that blurred shape, the more uncomfortable she felt, as if she were witnessing the same framing again in the present moment. Only now, as the observer, Memories of how everything ended began to stir. The summer when the nearby lake became a symbol of mourning. The news spreading that Raphael vanished in the dark water on a night no one should have been there. The wake without a body. The empty coffin, candles flickering before a smiling portrait. The bitter certainty that her first love met an early, unjust end. And yet, there was the recent letter, the familiar handwriting, the scent, the undeniable signs of someone pacing through those same rooms before her arrival. Helena slowly turned toward the bed. Something caught her attention. The old pendant he once gave her. She had lost it years ago, or believed she had. Now it rested in the exact center of the mattress, as if placed there deliberately, waiting for her return. The dark metal seemed to absorb the faint light of the room. The engraved symbol, with its curved and intertwined lines, formed a nearly hypnotic design, evoking both promise and threat. As she reached out to touch it, a sudden cold struck not her fingers, but the pit of her stomach, as if the simple act of approaching awakened something suspended in time. When she picked up the pendant, she noticed the back was different. Once smooth, it now bore a short, hastily carved inscription, "Some promises don't know how to die." It was no longer just a symbol of young love. Suddenly, it felt like a tangible link between past and present, between life and something far too close to death. Memories of the bodiless wake came flooding back, blending with the town's whispers about restless spirits, unresolved pacts, and things the lake never fully returned. Helena felt the mansion breathe around her. A distant sound of movement came from another room, soft like fabric dragging across the floor or bare footsteps gliding. The corridor seemed to tighten, the walls closing in, as if the physical space allowed itself to be molded by an invisible presence. She slipped a pendant into her pocket, afraid it might disappear again. She knew she shouldn't have done it, knew it would have been wiser to leave it behind, but something irresistible lived in the gesture. As if by keeping it, she accepted that she was still bound to a story that refused to end. As she left the bedroom, she noticed another disturbing detail. All the clocks in the mansion hanging on walls, resting on tables, forgotten on shelves seemed to have stopped at exactly the same time. The hands always pointed to the same specific minute, as if a single instant had been frozen and imposed upon the entire house. Helena didn't know what had happened at that exact hour in the past, but she had the distressing impression that she was walking toward the answer, whether she wanted to or not. She went back down to the lower floor, determined to explore the rest of the mansion before night fell completely. The living room kept the same solemn air as before, with the grand piano closed in a corner, partially covered by a white sheet, and the unlit fireplace marked by old soot stains. However, above the fireplace, something drew her attention. The large portrait of Raphael that had always been there now seemed different. It wasn't an obvious difference, but it was unsettling in its subtlety. The face was still the same, the serene expression, the delicate features, yet there was a nearly imperceptible shift in the painted eyes. Someone exactly where Helena was. The feeling of being watched intensified to the point of almost hurting. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as she stared at the painting. At that moment, a soft sound broke the silence. It came from the front door, as if something outside had lightly brushed against the wood. Helena felt her whole body react. Her heart sped up, her hands grew slightly damp, and her mind started listing rational possibilities: wind, branches, some animal from the woods around the house. But as she slowly approached the door, she noticed something that removed any simple explanation. Beneath the bottom gap, a sheet of paper had been pushed inside, as if someone had slid it in from the outside. She stayed still for a few seconds, watching the sheet of paper under the door as if it might move on its own. There was something deeply symbolic in that gesture. Someone, or something, had crossed the boundary between outside and inside. The past wasn't just calling to her, it was invading, taking shape, drawing nearer. When she finally bent down and picked up the paper, she felt the damp texture of fresh ink on her fingers. The handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, firm, with small details identical to the notes and letters he used to write her in their teenage years. The author's name wasn't there, but it didn't need to be. The recognition was immediate, visceral, as if that stroke had been drawn directly over her memory. The line written was short, but heavy with implication. "You entered, but you still don't know what you came to find." Helena's heart pounded harder, as if it were trying to answer before she could understand what it meant. The sensation of being watched intensified not just from afar, but from very close, as if invisible eyes followed the movement of her hands as she turned the paper to see if there was anything on the back. There wasn't, only that enigmatic message, simple and disconcerting. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her thoughts. Still on her knees, She brought her face closer to the door and tried to catch any sound from outside. Nothing but a thick silence, the kind of silence that seems to absorb noise instead of letting it escape. There was no wind, no footsteps, no hint that anyone could have been there seconds earlier, but someone had. She slowly stood up, holding the note as if it were a fragile piece of a puzzle just starting to reveal itself. She walked back to the center of the room, feeling every shadow as a potential threat. Raphael's portrait remained there, still and serene, but now it seemed to be watching not only the room, but the piece of paper in her hands. It was an absurd feeling, but impossible to ignore. The mansion, already melancholic by nature, now seemed to carry an even greater weight. The space felt smaller, the walls closer, the air dense enough to touch. The sense of a presence was almost physical, as if she weren't just inside the house, but inside someone, inside their memories, their secrets, their desires, and their fears. Still holding the note, Helena took a few steps toward the fireplace and noticed something she hadn't seen before. There were more marks on the floor, fine scratches that seemed to extend from the door and disappear under the old rug. It was impossible not to follow those clues. She circled around the rug, carefully lifting one of its worn edges, and there were more marks underneath, as if something had been dragged, or as if someone had walked that path over and over. Those marks hadn't been there years ago, which meant whatever was happening was recent, very recent. The air in the room felt colder now, a cold that seeped through the spaces between her bones, that didn't come from open windows, but from the environment itself. Helena closed her eyes for a moment, trying to find some logic. Maybe the mansion was being used by someone. Maybe that was all, although, deep down, she knew the simplest explanation didn't fit the details. It didn't explain the handwriting, the perfume, the pendant, the frozen clocks, and above all, it didn't explain the profound familiarity she felt with the invisible presence inhabiting that place. As if a forgotten part of her both recognized and feared whatever moved through the house. With the note still in her hands, she decided to explore another important part of the mansion, the old family study. It was a room that had always felt isolated from the rest of the house, as if it contained its own private microcosm. She remembered that, when young, Raphael used to say that place breathed differently. At the time, she thought he was just being overly poetic. Now, however, as she walked toward the study, she understood that maybe he had meant it literally. The study door was slightly ajar. She didn't remember leaving it that way when she'd gone down the upper corridor minutes earlier. A cold draft slipped through the gap, as if inside the room the temperature were different, lower, more static, more dead. When she carefully pushed the door open, a faint metallic smell surrounded her. The study was spacious, lined with tall shelves that reached the ceiling. Old books, dusty maps, and strange objects occupied every surface. In the center of the room, a sturdy desk with dark wooden drawers rested like a silent altar to the family's past. But that wasn't what caught her attention. It wasn't what made her entire body break out in goosebumps. On top of the desk, there was a new photograph, another one she didn't remember ever being taken. The image showed the mansion from the outside, but this time much more recent, probably from the last few days. The windows were open, the ivy more overgrown, the wood darker than she remembered, and at the front door, standing exactly where Helena had been minutes earlier, there was a solitary figure, herself. The same clothes, the same posture, the same expression of someone trying to understand the inexplicable. That could only mean one thing. Someone had taken that picture of her without her noticing, and they had done it not long ago. Her blood ran cold, her breathing turned shallow. It was as if inside that study time had stopped. Not in the sense of the frozen clocks, but in the sense of having been captured, imprisoned in a specific instant, and used by someone to watch her from a distance. On the photograph there was a pencil note, almost erased but still legible. "You came, just as you promised." Promise. That word echoed inside Helena's head. The pendant in her pocket seemed heavier, as if some silent energy flowed through it. She tried to recall exactly what promise she had made all those years ago. She remembered confused conversations, whispers by the lake, nights when the moon reflected on the dark water and he said things that sounded half poetic, half prophetic. But it was all too hazy, too fragmented, like memories torn from a dream. Something in the corner of the room caught her eye. One of the bookshelves was slightly pulled away from the wall. Only a few inches, but enough to cast a shadow that didn't match the rest. Helena approached slowly, feeling her heart pound hard, as if warning her she was about to touch something far too important, maybe far too dangerous. When she set her hand against the side of the shelf and pushed a little, she heard a hollow sound from behind it. There was an empty space there, a passage, a hiding place, a secret compartment. Her breath caught in her throat when she felt something touch her ankle. It wasn't a strong or aggressive touch. It was gentle, slow, deliberate, like the tip of a hand cold, very cold, sliding over her skin to say, "You're not alone." Helena's body froze. The entire study seemed to shrink around her, the air growing thicker, heavier, as every pore on her skin woke to the presence drawing near. For a few seconds, she couldn't move. The world reduced itself to that impossible sight. Pale fingers, too long, retreating back into the shadow as if the darkness were a body that welcomed them. It was a slow, almost lazy motion, as though the presence behind the shelf were fully aware of the terror it was causing and savored every fragment of fear it extracted from her. Helena's heart pounded so hard it seemed to warp the sounds around her. The study, once silent, now echoed with her own blood rushing through her veins, filling the room with a dull, steady thudding. Somewhere in the distance, one of the stopped clocks seemed to mock her, displaying the same frozen time, like a reminder that, in this place, time didn't obey the usual rules. Her mind reached for the safest explanation. It could be an animal, some strange creature that had taken shelter there. It could be a visual trick, an effect of light and shadow over misplaced objects. But despite all attempts at rationalizing, her body believed none of it. Every muscle, every nerve, every instinct screamed that this was not natural. It was a conscious presence, something that knew she was there, something that had chosen to reveal itself in small doses, like someone drawing back, inch by inch, a curtain hiding a macabre spectacle. The choice forced itself upon her: retreat or advance, run from that room, from the mansion, from the hill and everything it represented, or accept that her return hadn't been a whim of fate, but a summons. And if she had been called, perhaps something was waiting on the other side of that shelf. Helena took a deep breath and forced herself to step forward. The floor seemed to answer with a prolonged creak, like an old lament. She crouched, still trembling, and brought her hand close to the shadow beneath the shelf, not to touch it, but to feel the air. The cold there was different, almost cutting, as if at that exact point the laws of the world grew thin, opening space for something else. Without taking her eyes off the dark gap, she pressed her other hand more firmly to the side of the shelf and began to push. The wood resisted at first, as if it didn't want to move. Then it groaned and gave way a few more inches, revealing a wider opening from which an even denser darkness seemed to emerge. It wasn't just an absence of light, it was a particular quality of shadow, an old, saturated darkness that felt almost tangible. As the shelf slid aside, the sound of something scraping across the floor echoed, as if many objects had been shifted at once within that hidden space. A different smell escaped from inside, the scent of old paper mixed with something faintly sweet, like dried flowers kept for too long in a place without air. The gap became wide enough for Helena to peek through. Her eyes took a few seconds to adjust, but slowly shapes emerged. There was a small room behind the shelf, a kind of secret chamber or clandestine refuge. The walls were narrower, the ceiling lower, the entire space lit only by a tiny window, partially covered by heavy curtains that allowed just a thin line of light to pass. Inside that space, there was a simple table, a chair, and several stacked boxes. On the table, a dark-covered notebook lay open, as if someone had been reading it recently. Beside it, an extinguished candle still seemed to leave an imaginary trail of smoke in the room's memory, as if it had been blown out minutes before Helena arrived at the house. She hesitated before stepping in. She had the clear impression that this room represented the core of something that had been building long before her arrival. Her heart grew heavier the closer she got, not just with fear, but with a strange kind of anticipation, as if a part of her knew she would find there answers to questions she hadn't yet had the courage to ask. Crossing the threshold, she felt a subtle change in air pressure, almost imperceptibly, but enough for her body to respond with a shiver. She approached the table, eyes fixed on the dark notebook. The papers seemed to swallow the little light in the room, but the ink, in contrast, stood out sharply, as if the words were more present than the physical space around them. She leaned in and began to read. The first pages were old, dated many years back. They spoke of the mansion, the family, the rumors circulating through town, old stories about promises made in the shadow of the hill. The author wrote in the first person, describing sleepless nights, the feeling of being watched inside his own home, the impression that there was something in the lake that did not belong to the visible world. The name wasn't immediately clear, but the handwriting gave it away. There was no denying it. Raphael had written it. The notebook was a sort of hidden diary, an intimate record of things he had never had the courage to share with anyone, or at least anyone other than himself. As Helena turned the pages, she saw the tone of the text change. At first, the diary recorded gentle unrest, doubts, and youthful fears, reflections on death, destiny, and the feeling of not belonging anywhere. Over time, however, the words grew darker. He described recurring dreams, always set inside the mansion, where doors opened on their own and voices called his name with a shadowy familiarity. At a certain point, the diary mentioned a specific night by the lake, a night when the water seemed not to reflect the sky, but something beneath it, a night when Raphael wrote that he felt the presence of someone or something offering him a kind of silent pact. There were no clear details about what had been promised, but between the lines it was clear that he desperately wanted to be remembered, at any cost. He feared disappearing, feared that his existence would dissolve like mist at sunrise. The idea of being forgotten seemed more terrifying to him than death itself. And then, the pages began to mention Helena. At first, he spoke of her as a gentle light, something that had brought a pause to the darkness surrounding him. He described her presence as an unexpected comfort, a warmth slipping through the cracks of the house, making the shadows less threatening. But as the pages went on, something changed. Raphael began to write about his fear of losing her, fear of being abandoned, fear that after his departure she would move on with her life and leave all of this behind. The word promise appeared again, more and more obsessively. On one of the pages, the text spoke of a night when he supposedly made a silent vow at the edge of the lake, with a pendant in his hands, a vow that, whatever happened, he would find a way to remain tied to Helena's life. It didn't matter how much time passed. It didn't matter what needed to be sacrificed. The final pages seemed to have been written in a rushed, almost feverish rhythm. The handwriting grew unstable, the lines uneven, as if traced by a trembling hand. There were references to denser shadows moving through the house, to whispers in the early hours, to a presence watching him from the corners of the room, especially near the mirror and the windows. Then Helena reached a passage that froze every fiber of her body. Raphael described a feeling of duplicity, as if two versions of himself existed at the same time. One, the one who walked among the living and still experienced sunlight, touch, and voice. The other, the one who already belonged to something dark, deep, and silent, like the waters of the lake. He said he felt that, soon, he would have to choose which version would remain, and whichever he chose, the bond with Helena would not be broken. The diary ended abruptly, with an unfinished sentence. The pen had scratched across the page halfway through a word, and then nothing more, as if something had interrupted him at the exact moment he tried to record one last thought. When Helena lifted her head, she realized the space around her seemed darker, as if the small window had lost part of its ability to let in light. The silence was different now, heavier, as if filled with hidden meanings. She felt the weight of the freshly read words pressing against her chest. She understood this wasn't just an old diary, but an imperfect map pointing toward a kind of pact she didn't fully understand. A pact that involved fear of being forgotten, the desire for permanence, and a promise made on the shore of a lake that, years later, would be the stage of a disappearance never truly explained. As she turned the notebook to close it, something fell out and landed at her feet. It was a folded piece of paper, newer than the aged pages. The texture was recent, the color still vivid. When Helena unfolded it, she saw once again the same handwriting that marked the letter and the note at the door. There was no date, no place, just a sentence that seemed written for the exact moment she was reading it, years after the last entry in the diary. He had once said that first love never dies, but on that sheet, he added a darker truth. If love was strong enough to survive death, it might also be strong enough to destroy everything that came after. The cold breath against her nape was not just a thermal sensation, it was almost a physical memory, as if invisible fingers traced the base of her neck, sending shivers up Helena's spine like a rising tide of ice. Her body stiffened on reflex. There was no wind in there. The tiny window barely allowed light through, much less air. So whatever had produced that breath was extraordinarily close. Close enough to feel the texture of her skin, the heat of her fear, the hesitation in her breathing. Helena stayed frozen, her fingers still holding the note found inside the diary. The silence following the breath wasn't empty. It was filled with tense expectation, as if the room itself were waiting for her reaction, as if something behind her wanted to know whether she dared to turn around, but she didn't. The fear was too great, too dense. Instead, she slowly closed her eyes, trying to control her breathing, as if that could soften the presence drawing near. A presence without weight, but full of intention. A presence that produced shivers instead of footsteps, shadows instead of form. Then came the whisper. It didn't come with the breath, because it made no sound. It didn't vibrate the air. It didn't touch her ears. It bloomed in her mind like a thought that wasn't hers, like a phrase planted directly into her consciousness. You came back. Those two words hit harder than any physical noise, not because they were threatening in themselves, but because they carried recognition. They weren't a warning, nor a question, they were a statement, proof that the presence had been following her since the moment she stepped into the mansion, or perhaps long before that. The instinct to run took hold of Helena's body. Her muscles begged for movement, for distance, for light, but reasoned that part of her that had chosen to return and investigate forced her to stand her ground. She inhaled slowly, opened her eyes, and with calculated effort turned her head just enough to glimpse the corner of the room. There was no one there, but the shadow behind her was different. Before, it was a discreet blot, a natural patch of darkness cast by the shelf. Now, however, it seemed deeper, as if it had volume, as if something occupied that space, even if invisible. Helena stepped back, instinctively moving closer to the narrow door that led back into the study. The note in her hands trembled. Her heart seemed ready to punch through her chest to escape that claustrophobic space. For a moment, she thought of running, but when her eyes flicked back to the open diary on the table, she noticed something that hadn't been there before. A new sentence, written across the blank page that should have closed the notebook. The same handwriting, the same fresh ink. "I'm not finished." The sentence carried extraordinary weight, as if it were a direct continuation of the last words cut off years ago, as if the author, dead, missing, changed, were resuming the diary at the exact moment she had found it. The air grew even colder, cold enough for Helena to see her own breath escaping her lips, cold enough for her body to answer with an involuntary shiver. That secret room wasn't just a hidden space. It was a threshold, a meeting point between what lives and what insists on remaining. She decided she had to get out, now. She stepped toward the opening behind the bookshelf and squeezed through the narrow passage. As she crossed back into the study, she heard something from inside the hidden room, a faint noise, like fabric dragging along the floor, or like the shifting of someone trying to stand after a very long time lying still. Helena didn't wait to find out. She yanked the shelf back with force, sliding it into its original position. The impact against the wall echoed in a dull thud that seemed to roll through the mansion like a muffled thunder. And then the silence returned, but not a natural silence. It was a kind of suspended sound, as if everything around her were alert, waiting for her next move. She left the study in quick steps, almost stumbling over the carpet in the hallway. The mansion felt different, as if it were breathing in an irregular rhythm. The shadows seemed to move with more autonomy, and the air smelled more intensely of old wood and dampness, as if every wall were sweating the memories of accumulated years. She descended the stairs carefully, though her body shook too much. Each step creaked beneath her feet, producing a noise like ancient bones. The main hall was darker than before, even with the light filtering through the high windows. It was as if the day had advanced without her noticing, as if time inside that mansion flowed at its own pace, a pace that didn't respect hours or minutes. The door where the note had been slid under remained closed. The paper still lay on the mantel, where she had left it moments earlier. But there was something different on the floor near the doorframe. A dark mark, very faint, like a damp footprint, that began right at the door and led into the room. Helena moved closer. The mark was thin, elongated, and seemed to have been made by a bare foot. However, the shape wasn't entirely human. The toes were long, longer than they should be. With her heart racing, she followed the marks. 1, 2, 3 indistinct footprints, broken here and there by the old carpet or the change in floor texture. They didn't lead toward the main corridor, but to a side door, a door she recognized immediately, the entrance to the mansion's old basement. The basement had always been an uncomfortable place. In her teenage years, Helena avoided going down there. The ceiling was low, the smell too strong, and the wooden steps always seemed on the verge of breaking. Raphael, however, had a habit of vanishing into that space whenever he wanted to escape his family or his own thoughts. He used to say there was enough silence there to hear your own soul or to hear what came after it. She grabbed the doorknob. It was cold. Cold like the pendant in her pocket. Cold like the breath she'd felt on her neck. She opened the door. The darkness of the basement was almost absolute, broken only by a thin beam of light from a high window, too small to illuminate more than a few steps. The smell was heavy, mixing damp wood, earth, and something that resembled old iron. At the top of the stairs, Helena hesitated. This was the path the unknown presence had followed. This was the direction the marks pointed to. But it was also the place that, in all her memories, Raphael never mentioned without a certain weight in his voices. If there was something down there he feared, but couldn't stay away from. She went down the first step, the second, the third. The air grew colder with each step. The silence felt alive. And then, as she set her foot on the fourth step, she heard something she hadn't expected. A faint, steady, almost imperceptible sound, like knocking, not footsteps, not whispers, knocking, slow, rhythmic, as if coming from behind one of the basement's stone walls, or as if someone were asking to be found. The knocking went on not like independent noises, but like reflections, echoes of Helena's own body. It was as if the basement had become a second heart, beating in sync with hers. With each knock, the air seemed to tremble slightly, a nearly invisible vibration, but enough to make the old wall lamps quiver on their rusted brackets. Helena went down one more step, and the crack of the wood echoed like a muffled scream. Down there, the silence had density. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of something filling the space between noises, a living, expectant silence, as if the room were waiting for her next breath to shape the darkness around her. When she finally reached the last step, she stopped for a moment. Her eyes tried to adapt to the gloom of the basement. Only one shaft of light from the small upper window cut through the space and touched the packed dirt floor. There, exactly where the light fell, the damp footprints vanished. As if, somehow, the trail had dissolved upon entering the lit area, or as if the light itself were capable of erasing traces that didn't belong to the ordinary world. The first thing she noticed was the smell. It was stronger down there. Damp wood, old dust, rust, and something else. Something familiar and disturbing at the same time, like Raphael's cologne mixed with notes of something no longer tied to a living body. A cold, almost sweet scent that stirred nausea and nostalgia at once. Helena walked slowly, feeling the uneven ground beneath her feet. The basement wasn't large, but it felt bigger than she remembered, as if the walls had drawn back over time. The mansion seemed to expand and contract according to her emotions, like a living creature synchronized with her every move. On the left side, there was a set of old shelves, with dusty jars holding liquids darkened by age. Farther on, stacked wooden crates formed a sort of improvised wall, and some of them bore recent marks in, almost parallel scratches like the ones she'd seen on the hall floor. Those marks were beginning to reveal a pattern, something repeated throughout the house, like small signs left by restless hands. In the center of the basement, however, there was something new. A circle, made of disturbed earth, stones arranged in irregular order, and small marks on the ground indicating that something had been dragged into it. The circle didn't look like the result of construction or old repairs. It had an obvious symbolism and intention. Helena approached slowly, the skin on her arms prickling even before she fully understood what she was seeing. It was a ritual circle, not in the literal sense of formal magic, but in the more primitive sense of space created to isolate, to contain, to draw something in. At its center, something made her hold her breath. A metallic object, similar to an old brooch, was partially buried, reflecting the light in broken fragments. She crouched down carefully. The object was small, circular, with the same kind of symbol that appeared on the pendant in her pocket. Curved, intertwined lines formed an abstract figure, almost organic, but there was one clear difference. While her pendant merely looked old, this one looked worn, as if it had been held countless times by an impatient hand, as if it had been the target of devotion or of desperation. When she touched it, Helena felt a faint vibration. Not a physical vibration, but an inner one, as if something inside her responded to the contact. Her heart sped up. The knocking in the basement sped up too, matching her rhythm like a spectral double. It was as though the entire space were connecting directly to her body, testing every reaction. She pulled the object from the soil, and at the exact moment she lifted it, she heard a sound. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't a whisper. It was a sigh. The sound came from behind her, deep and uneven, as if someone's lungs long dormant had expanded for the first time. The sigh echoed against the stone wall, shaking loose small clouds of dust. Helena's skin prickled all at once, and she turned slowly, measuring each movement only to see that the shadow behind her seemed to have changed shape. In the darkest corner of the basement, where the window's light could not reach, there was now a subtle silhouette. It wasn't solid. It was made of density, of intent, of a contour that seemed to form and dissolve at the same time. The shadow looked restless, as if it were struggling to breathe, oscillating between existing and disappearing. Helena unconsciously stepped back. The silhouette reacted to her movement, inclining slightly toward her, not with aggression, but with recognition, as if it had been waiting for that moment. The object in her hand began to heat up, not with ordinary warmth, but with an inner intense heat, as if it had awakened. The engraved symbol pulsed faintly. Helena felt an old memory surface, a forgotten fragment, like a dream trying to return after many years buried. She remembered a night by the lake. She remembered Raphael holding that same object or something very similar while whispering a promise she could no longer fully recall. words that had dissolved over time, but whose feeling had remained. Something about never leaving her. Something about finding a way back, no matter how much time passed. Then the silhouette moved. It was only one step alight, almost imperceptible shift, but enough to make the ritual circle react. The earth around the symbol trembled, as if something beneath it were waking up. She realized, with rising horror, that the shadow was not just a presence, it was a projection, something that depended on her to gain full form. And the basement seemed eager to help. The knocking returned faster now, almost frantic. The shadow took a second step. The heat of the object intensified, nearly burning Helena's palm. Her breath grew shallow and uneven, as if the air itself were no longer enough. In that moment she knew she had to get out. She had to break the growing link between herself and whatever was awakening there. She straightened up, turned, and began to climb the stairs in haste. But on the third step, she heard another sound different from the previous ones. A sound that froze her spine. Footsteps, not imagined, not metaphorical concrete footsteps. Rhythmic, as if someone were coming up the basement stairs behind her. She sped up, driven by pure instinct, but the footsteps sped up too, matching her movements, as if the thing were learning to walk in that very instant. At the top of the stairs, she almost lost her balance as she shoved the basement door closed. When the wood slammed shut, something on the other side hit the door with violence, not like a punch, but like the body of someone who had tried to cross and found an unexpected barrier. The door shook. A second thud followed, then silence. Helena staggered back, the object still seared in her hand. And for the first time since entering the mansion, something inside her began to arrange itself into understanding. Not fully, but enough to shape a clear thought. Raphael was not simply tied to that place's past, he was being rebuilt by it. Or by something that used his love as a point of entry. And Helena was an essential part of the process. The phrase scratched into the floor seemed to pulse on its own. Now you feel, now you remember. There was no ink, only deep grooves. As if fingernails or something like them had carved those words into the wood with desperate force. Helena stared at the message for a few moments, trying to tell whether the markings were recent or old, but it was like trying to date a nightmare. What mattered wasn't the time, it was the fact that she didn't remember it being there before. What had begun as a melancholic return to the mansion of her past was now taking the shape of a trap. Every room she explored seemed to respond directly to her. Every step she took echoed into something that reacted, as if a scattered intelligence within the walls had awakened and started to organize itself around her. The metallic object she'd brought from the basement still burned in her hand. She finally forced herself to open it, revealing the surface branded with the intricate symbol. The metal didn't look red, but the heat coming from it seemed to originate from somewhere beyond simple friction or electricity. It was an old heat, ritual in nature, as if it carried fragments of a promise made in another time. In a setting where the sky itself might have been a different color, Helena slipped the object into the same pocket where the original pendant already rested. The combined weight of the two seemed to throw her slightly off balance, as if it disturbed not only her body's center of gravity, but some deeper internal equilibrium. A faint buzzing began to vibrate in her head, not painful, but insistent, like two different frequencies trying to tune to each other. She then realized she needed air from outside. The mansion had become a sealed organism, saturated with memories and presences, pressing against her chest. Without thinking too much, she walked to one of the windows on the lower floor, forced it open, and let the hill's air slowly invade the room. The wind outside wasn't exactly pleasant. It carried the scent of damp earth, old leaves, and a faint metallic note drifting from the distant lake, but, compared to the heaviness inside the house, it was almost liberating. From up there, the town of Fog Valley looked the same as always. Small houses, narrow streets, a central square with crooked trees and a bandstand that had once hosted parties, confessions, and farewells. Life down there moved at a rhythm that, from above, seemed almost normal. People crossing streets, lights turning on as the afternoon advanced, smoke rising from scattered chimneys. Part of Helena wanted to walk down the hill, blend into the everyday routine, pretend none of this was happening, but another part, the part still feeling the heat of the objects in her pocket, still hearing the echo of knocks in the basement, knew there was no way back to ignorance. Returning to the mansion had not been just a physical act, it was a return to an old promise, to a breaking point in her life that she had, until then, covered with layers of silence. One particular memory began to push its way forward with more clarity. It didn't come fully formed, but as a bundle of sensations, the cold texture of a stone beneath her hands, the trembling reflection of the moon on the lake's dark surface, Raphael's presence beside her, the words he had murmured so softly that, at the time, she'd barely heard them. She remembered only that he spoke of fear of death, of not wanting to disappear, of the idea that some people simply refused to accept an end. Maybe, she thought now, he hadn't been speaking in the abstract. The mansion seemed to agree. Helena stepped away from the window and crossed the main hall once more. Her eyes were drawn back to the large portrait of Raphael above the fireplace. His painted face looked sharper, more defined than before, as if someone had recently retouched the canvas. The eyes especially seemed to carry a brightness that wasn't natural in paintings, a brightness almost moist, as if they were carefully watching every movement in the room. She moved closer, guided by a mixture of fascination and revulsion. There was tenderness in the way the artist had rendered his features, the delicate lips, the smooth contours of his cheekbones, the gaze that seemed forever on the verge of saying something important. But beneath that tenderness, there was an unease that now stood out clearly. It was as if, even in the painting, Raphael knew he was incomplete, that something was still missing. A question began to grow in her mind, silent and insidious. To what extent had he chosen this? The diary pages still pulsed in her memory. His fear of being forgotten, the obsession with the idea that first love could not be allowed to die, the desire to remain present at any cost. Until now, Helena had always imagined Raphael as a victim of circumstance, the boy who vanished into the lake's dark waters, the love cut short, the eternal grief. But in light of what she had just discovered, the narrative was starting to change. There had been decisions, there had been choices, there had been, perhaps, a pact, and if there had been a pact, she had to admit it hadn't been made alone. The memory by the lake kept trying to surface but remained wrapped in a kind of inner fog, as if part of it were deliberately covered. She felt that if she could pierce that mental smoke, she would find the origin of the bond now threatening to cross the boundaries between life and death. The words scratched into the floor, "Now you feel, or now you remember," felt like both invitation and threat. The mansion wanted her to remember. It wanted her to relive every detail, especially the painful ones. Maybe most of all the painful ones. Exhausted by the weight of these revelations, Helena sat for a few moments in an old armchair facing the dead fireplace. The imagined crackle of a non-existent fire played in her mind, accompanied by other memories of nights once spent there, when everything still seemed normal or at least manageable. In the current silence, she began to notice a subtle change in the way she herself was feeling. It wasn't just fear. Hidden between the layers of terror and strangeness, there was a stab of longing. Longing for Raphael, yes, but not just for the boy she remembered, also for what he represented, a time when love seemed capable of defying any limit, when promises whispered at the edge of a lake felt as binding as secret laws, a time when she still believed that intensity and permanence inevitably walked hand in hand. That longing was dangerous, because if whatever was awakening in the house used love as a bridge, then any nostalgia could become fuel. Any tender memory, any desire to reunite could be twisted, manipulated, turned into a tool by something that might no longer be entirely human. Helena realized this clearly and felt a contradictory impulse grow inside her. Part of her wanted to fight, to break the bond, to burn the objects, to leave the mansion and never look back. Another part, however, wanted to go down the hill just to come back again, like someone unable to abandon an unfinished story. There were too many questions, too many promises hanging in the air. The late afternoon light began to shift, turning more orange as it entered through the windows. Shadows stretched across the floor, climbing the walls like dark fingers. It was the kind of hour when the human mind naturally opens itself more to fear neither day nor night, just an interval where everything seems possible. A soft sound caught her attention. It didn't come from upstairs, nor from the basement. It came from the back door, the one that opened onto the mansion's yard, and, beyond that, the trail leading to the lake. It was the sound of metal against metal, a gentle, insistent clinking, like someone playing with a chain, a clasp, a lock. Helena stood, increasingly alert. She walked toward the source of the noise and found the door slightly ajar. She didn't remember leaving it that way. A cold draft slipped through the gap, bringing with it a smell that mixed still water and old leaves, the distinct scent of the lake at dusk. The clinking was coming from outside. As she crossed the threshold, she saw the chain hanging from a hook on the side of the house, swinging on its own despite the absence of any noticeable wind. The metal vibrated in a rhythmic way, as if someone had set it in motion only seconds earlier and then stepped away. From the yard, the view of the lake was clearer. The dark surface reflected the sky stained orange and violet, creating a distorted mirror. The trail leading down to the shore was covered in dry leaves, but there were clear marks along the way, footprints, scratches, small patches where the earth seemed to have been disturbed. Helena didn't need much thought to understand the silent invitation. The past was calling her back to the same place where everything had begun or ended. The lake wasn't just a place associated with Raphael's death. Now, it was clear that, in some way, it had also been the stage for an agreement made in the shadows. If there was a greater secret hidden in that story, it was likely somewhere between the mansion and that dark water. As she watched the trail, the pendant in her pocket vibrated. Not literally, but with a sensation so clear it might as well have been real movement. The object from the basement seemed to answer the same frequency. For a brief moment, Helena imagined that if she took them out of her pocket, she would see some kind of physical reaction between them, like two magnets destined to meet. She felt the decision approaching, inevitable. She could close the door, lock the chain, go upstairs and spend the night trying to ignore the knocks, the whispers, the messages, or she could follow the trail, go down, once more, to the edge of the lake where her first love had disappeared, and perhaps had never truly left. And if the secret title of this story was, "My First Love Has Returned," the silent question behind it was beginning to press down on her with unbearable weight. Returned for what? To complete a promise? Or to destroy her with the same intensity with which he once promised to love her? The first step onto the trail produced a sound that, at first, seemed like nothing more than leaves crushed under her weight. But as she continued, Helena realized it echoed in a strange way, as if the ground itself were responding to her movement. The sound didn't just spread across the earth, it seemed to be absorbed by the atmosphere, and sent back to her in a low, nearly inaudible tone, like an underground whisper. The path circling the mansion had always been narrow, lined with crooked trees that leaned toward one another, forming a natural corridor. In childhood, the path had seemed welcoming to her, a refuge for stolen conversations and exchanged glances. In adolescence, it became a secret passage for forbidden meetings. Now, however, it felt like walking through the inside of a wooden-throaten organic corridor that breathed with her, that pulsed beneath her feet. The farther she went, the more the environment seemed to change. The sound of birds began to fade, followed by the near-complete disappearance of natural noises. The forest around her seemed to slip into suspension. The wind, which had blown in light gusts before, now barely moved the leaves. Even the light appeared to hesitate as it filtered through the treetops. The trail sank into an uneven twilight, casting long distorted shadows that stretched out ahead of her like thin, eager arms. It was in that silence that Helena realized the most unsettling thing. She wasn't just going toward the lake. She was being led. The pendant and the object from the basement grew heavier in her pocket, as if pulling her body in the right direction. With each step, she felt them pulse faintly, like two out-of-sync hearts trying to find a shared rhythm. And although they stayed inside her pocket, the sense of a link between them and, by extension, between her and whatever waited ahead grew stronger. The hazy memory of the lake began to reconstruct itself within her, not clearly, but in sensory details. The damp smell of the water, the sound of small waves hitting the rocks, Raphael's hand holding hers with uncertainty, a gesture that, at the time, she had interpreted as tenderness, but that now, in light of the new revelations, sounded more like desperation. The trail ended at a small slope where the ground suddenly became wetter. There the lake opened up before Helena like a dark mirror, completely still. It was as if it didn't breathe, as if it were a liquid blade separating the real world from whatever existed beneath its surface. The water reflected the sky in the making of night, tones of deep blue, dying orange, and pale violet melting into a disturbing palette. The horizon line looked distorted, as if the light itself avoided touching the center of the lake. That absence of brightness created a feeling of infinite depth, a lure and a trap. Helena stepped closer to the bank, feeling the moisture seep into her soles. The air there had a different temperature, colder, thicker. With every breath, it was as if she were inhaling fragments of old memories, whispered words, choked promises, laughter that no longer echoed in reality. The past seemed to rise from the surface like vapor. She knelt at the edge without really knowing why. The lake had always had that effect on her, a magnetic pull that drew her in even when her instincts told her to step back. Maybe because part of her story was submerged there, waiting to be unearthed. Maybe because part of her was still bound to Raphael, even if she didn't understand what he had become. As she watched the water, something appeared on the surface. Not a clear shape, just a soft ripple, so faint it seemed created by the air itself. But Helena knew that lake didn't ripple on its own. Its center almost always remained completely still, as if bound to some kind of silent pact. Whatever had caused that movement was alive, or present, or both. She flinched instinctively, planting herself more firmly in the damp ground. The lake returned to silence. And then, Suddenly, the pendant in her pocket warmed not with the ritualistic heat from before, but a familiar temperature, almost human. It was like feeling Raphael's palm for an instant, a known warmth, impossible, intimate. A deep emotion cut through Helena's hardness, longing, confusion, fear. It was as if two conflicting feelings collided inside her, the desire to see him again and the terror of what might be waiting for her, because in that moment, she understood something she'd been avoiding since the beginning. The Raphael she had known might not be the same one calling her now, and maybe he never had been. The surface of the lake rippled again. This time, more clearly. Helena held her breath. This time there was no ambiguity. Something was moving beneath the water. Something large enough to create slow, deep waves. Waves that rolled toward the bank where she knelt, pushing small stones and dry leaves back onto the shore. Instinct screamed at her to run. But something stronger held her there, the bond, the promise, the memory stuck in her throat. She didn't stand up. She just waited, skin tingling, heart beating in an anxious, uneven rhythm. That's when she heard it. A name, her name. It didn't come through her ears. It didn't come from the air. It was as if the lake had found a way to speak directly to her body, vibrating the water inside her cells, transmitting a silent call, and the call said, "Helena." She brought her hand to her pocket, feeling both objects vibrate at the same time. The heat and the energy seemed to sync with the voice. For a few seconds, everything around her blurred as if the mansion, the forest, and even the sky had become background scenery, and only the lake remained. The water began to spin, slowly, like a spiral rising from the bottom. The motion was almost hypnotic. Small leaves started to fall into the vortex, disappearing as if swallowed. The sound of something scraping the submerged stones reached her, sending a vibration through the earth and up into her body. Helena froze, because she realized something even more disturbing. The vortex was gradually forming a figure, not a full body, not yet, but the outline of a face that seemed sculpted by the water itself, a face too young to belong to someone dead, a face she knew, that part of her had wanted to see. Eyes not yet fully formed, but that seemed to look at her with a supernatural intensity. It was Raphael, or something that wanted her to believe it was Raphael. The wind suddenly blew, cold and strong, pushing her hair back. The lake stirred in response. The figure in the water seemed to gain definition, emerging for a few seconds before dissolving again into distorted shapes. And then came the whisper. This time it was audible, coming from the air, as if someone were right beside her, kneeling exactly where she was. "You promised you'd never leave me." The sound went through Helena as if it had weight. It was a voice she knew deeply, but there was something wrong with it. A distortion, a deeper echo layered underneath, as if more than one entity were speaking at once. The water went still again. The figure vanished, but the presence remained. Helena took a deep breath. For the first time since returning to the mansion, she felt part of the truth beginning to surface, and it was far from comforting. The love she had lived in her youth wasn't simply coming back. It was being rebuilt. Remade from fear, from memory, and from the pact they had both started the night the lake witnessed their promise. And now, whatever was awakening, whether it was Raphael or something using his memory, wanted her to play the role that belonged to her. It wanted her to complete the ritual. That single wave rolling toward her didn't seem to rise from the lake's surface. It wasn't the result of wind or of some submerged creature. It was an isolated wave, as if created intentionally. Liquid message sent to the shore where Helena sat. When the water touched her shoes, she felt a cold so extreme it seemed to pass through fabric, skin, and bone. It was as if the lake were trying to recognize her, to identify her body by its temperature, by its reaction, by the vibration her fear produced. An old cold, deep, unnatural, a cold that felt as if it had been stored inside someone or something for far too many years. Helena stepped back, but only once. Her legs seemed to hesitate, as if some invisible ballast were anchoring her movements. The memory of the face emerging from the water was still too fresh in her mind. She couldn't shake the sense that she hadn't seen an illusion. There had been form in that image, there had been intention, and there had been memory. Kneeling again by the shore, she forced herself to look at the motionless surface. The lake, like a dark eye, seemed to stare back at her. Its edges were blurred, hiding any notion of depth. It was impossible to tell where the light ended and the water began. It was a bottomless well end at the same time. A surface so flat it looked sealed by some ancient pact. As she watched, a memory insisted on rising, now clearer than before. The night of the promise, it didn't return as a continuous film, but as fragments that slowly fit together. The gentle warmth of Raphael's hand holding hers. The moon reflected like a coin broken in half. The sound of small waves hitting the rocks. His voice trembling between devotion and fear. and above all, the strange sensation, uncomfortable, yet somehow seductive, that they were not alone that night. Something was watching them, something was listening, something was waiting. Helena hadn't understood then why Raphael had insisted on taking her to the lake so late. He'd said he needed to tell her something important, that there were things about his family and about the mansion that she didn't know. There are truths that can only be spoken in front of water, he had murmured at the time. She'd thought it was just poetic. Now, it sounded like a code. The lost words of the promise began to return, not as complete sentences, but as sensations trying to form letters. If I disappear, if something calls me, if I can't come back, and then the part her mind had tried for years to bury, you won't let me die. Helena jerked away from the shore, her heart racing. The evening light seemed to have dimmed even more, plunging the forest into dense shadows. The lake now reflected only total darkness, with no trace of the sky's color, as if it were absorbing all the light around it. She rose slowly, struggling to breathe. The growing feeling was that the lake knew she was there. It knew what she remembered. It knew what she feared. And it knew what she still wanted, even if it was only the memory of love. Suddenly, something gleamed on the ground near a half-submerged rock. A soft reflection, a point of metallic light against the deadly contrast of the dark water. Helena approached. Hesitant, she crouched and brushed aside some of the mud with her fingertips. The object was there, partially buried, but clearly placed, almost exposed, as if it had been waiting only for her to find it. It was a ring, Raphael's ring, the same ring he had always worn on the finger of his left hand, saying it had belonged to his grandfather and contained something even older than the family Espla, the ring that, after his disappearance, had never been found. Now it was there, cold, impossibly intact. Helena picked it up carefully. The metal seemed to pulse, not with a heartbeat rhythm, but with something different, as if the vibration of the lake were being transferred into it. And when she touched it, a much clearer memory took shape. She remembered Raphael holding that ring as he spoke about refusing to accept the idea that death was final. Remembered him saying that people remember words but forget the weight of decisions made in silence. Remembered him saying that if a love was strong enough, it could span worlds. Not just this one. She brought the ring to her chest, feeling the metal grow even colder. And it was in that exact moment that she sensed something behind her, a soft sound. Footsteps on the trail. They were not dragging feet, not animals. They were human footsteps. But there was something wrong with them. The rhythm was too irregular, as if the legs didn't fully obey the body. As if each step were the result of trial and error. As if the person or the thing walking were learning to use newly formed limbs. Helena turned, heart lodged in her throat. The trail was empty, but the footsteps continued. And now they were clearer. Closer. More guided. She backed toward the lake, without realizing she was dangerously near the edge. The air grew even colder, so cold it brought tears to her eyes. The footsteps stopped, and then came the sound. A whisper, not from the water, not from the wind. From the corridor of trees, from the trail, a voice that seemed torn in two, one part human, the other echoing from somewhere that did not belong to the physical world. Helena, she recognized it instantly. But this time, it wasn't just her name spoken as a call. It was spoken as an accusation, as a charge, as a promise. She tried to retreat further, but her heel slipped in the mud. The ring fell from her hand and rolled until it touched the water, sinking instantly. Helena dropped to her knees to grab it, but froze when she saw what was happening on the surface. Something was rising, something that displaced the water without sinking. A human outline, a torso, arms, hands. The water molded itself to that form like a thin fabric, creating the illusion of liquid skin. The face was still incomplete, but the eyes, or the place where they should be, shone with a grayish light. A light Helena knew, but that now seemed to belong to something far beyond Raphael. The voice returned. You called me back. Helena hadn't called him, but the bond had, the longing had, the promise had, and now that thing was answering. The liquid figure moved forward, water streaming from its arms in continuous strands. The movement was slow, almost gentle, but there was a buried strength in it, an intention that left no doubt. Raphael, or the thing wearing his face, wanted to reach her, wanted to complete her, wanted to fulfill the pact they had begun years ago. And there was something else, even more terrifying. The figure didn't seem to be emerging from the lake. It seemed to be returning to it, as if it had come from somewhere much deeper and was now relearning the human shape, relearning Raphael's shape, relearning how to approach her. Helena took a step back, but the ground gave way slightly, as if the lake were trying to pull her in with invisible fingers of earth. The wind turned colder. The trees began to creak, as if some internal pressure were building in the air. The figure raised its head. It now had something resembling a smile, not tender, not loving, a smile made of water and shadow that seemed to say, "I came back, and you have nowhere to run." The first footprint the figure left on the ground looked like the negative of a human being. The outline resembled a foot, but what filled it was cold vapor, an absence of matter condensed into shape. The water ran back around it, returning to the lake, while that thing, still partially liquid, remained standing on the shore, as if testing its own existence. Helena felt the ground vibrate beneath her feet, not with the force of an earthquake, but with the pulse of something passing through the soil like a silent wave. The figure tilted its head, watching her with an interest that was both intimate and alien. There was something in that gesture that reminded her of Raphael in the afternoons when he would watch her in silence, as if trying to memorize every detail of her. But now, that same posture carried a predatory intensity, as if she were not just someone loved, but also a focal point, a target, a center of gravity for a will that came from very far away. The water that formed the outline of that body began to reorganize. What had been just a blurred silhouette now started to gain sharper lines, shoulders, neck, the features of a face growing more defined. Helena watched, with mounting horror, as details she recognized appeared, the shape of the chin, the line of the mouth, the contour of the eyes. It was like watching a portrait slowly step out of the paper into flesh, or into a corrupted version of flesh. Even so, something didn't fit. This wasn't simply Raphael returning. It was an imitation built from memory, longing, and something darker. The eyes in particular held a depth that didn't belong to human recollection. They seemed like miniature wells, each one reflecting the same darkness that lay at the center of the lake. Helena stepped back again, and once more the ground gave slightly. The edge of the bank felt unstable, as if part of it were being quietly eroded from within. It was as if the lake were expanding invisible boundaries, stretching underneath the earth, trying to reach her not only with water, but with everything it contained. The figure took another step forward. This time, the movement was more solid. Cold vapor rose for a moment from its footprints before vanishing, leaving only a faint metallic smell in the air, mixed with something like wet wood and ancient, decaying flowers. The air grew heavier with every inch that thing advanced. Some memories, until then fragmented, began to align inside Helena. She remembered the diary hidden behind the shelf, the hurried lines in the final pages, Raphael's obsession with the idea of permanence, his almost fanatical belief that first love could not be erased by time or death. And she remembered the night by the lake, when he spoke of giving up something of himself in exchange for not being forgotten. At that point, a truth began to surface, sharp and merciless. His death had not been just a tragedy. It had been part of a process, a transition, a crossing, and she, without fully understanding it, had been present at the signing of that pact. The liquid figure stopped a few meters away. Now it had an almost complete face. The hair still seemed made of strands of water running down over the face in continuous strips, but the features beneath that surface were unmistakable. It was Raphael, and, at the same time, an enlarged version of the fear she had always had of losing him. The air between them seemed to compress. The world around them shrank to that point on the shore, to that invisible line that separated them. On one side, someone who still belonged to the world of the living. On the other, something returning from a place where the categories of life and death no longer made sense. A thought burst into Helena's mind before she could stop it. If that thing needed a fully solid body to remain, maybe hers was the final piece. Not as a traditional sacrifice, but as a vessel, as a mirror, as the definitive bridge between what lives and what refuses to die. The realization of that possibility hit Helena with physical force. Without thinking, she turned and ran. Her body reacted before her mind could form any plan. Branches scratched her arms as she climbed the trail in stumbling strides. Dry leaves crackled under her feet, producing an audible trail the forest itself could follow. Her heart pounded wildly, her breath came in short bursts, and the air far too cold burned in her lungs. Behind her, the silence didn't last long. Soon came the footsteps. An uneven, irregular sound, as if whoever was following her still hadn't mastered the act of walking on solid ground. There were slight stumbles, scrapes, small slips, but even so, the pursuit advanced. With each second, Helena had the clear impression that the thing was learning that with every meter crossed, it became more skilled, faster, more adapted to the environment. The narrow trail began to feel longer, steeper than it had ever been. The mansion in the distance seemed to retreat on the horizon, as if it too were pulling away from her. But slowly, its silhouette reappeared between the trees, old and imposing, as though waiting for her with open arms. The dark windows looked like watchful eyes, following her run with an indecipherable curiosity. When she finally reached the yard, Helena almost fell to her knees. but forced herself to keep moving. The back door remained ajar like the mouth of a dubious refuge. She stepped inside, feeling the sudden change in temperature as she crossed the threshold. The interior of the mansion was even colder, as if all the warmth of the day had been drained from it. She slammed the door shut, making the glass rattle in the frames. Then she leaned her body against it, as if she could serve as a living barrier between whatever was outside and the inside of the house. For a few seconds she heard only her own heart and the low hum of panic in her ears. Then, the sound. A knock from outside. Not loud, but slow, deliberate, like the touch of someone patient. Once, twice, 3 times. The wood vibrated slightly. The cold seeped through the surface and pierced her skin like needles of ice. Helena squeezed her eyes shut, feeling a wave of nausea rise from her stomach to her chest. The whole mansion seemed to hold its breath with her. The knocking stopped. No footsteps walking away. No scratching, just the sudden interruption, as if the presence outside had decided it no longer needed that kind of communication. Helena pushed away from the door. Staggering, the house seemed to spin slowly, as if she were inside an organism rearranging itself around a new center. The air smelled of something metallic and damp, as if the lake had found a way to seep its scent through the walls. The main hall seemed darker. Raphael's portrait above the fireplace seemed sharper. The painted eyes appeared to shine with an inner light, following her every step. In that fixed gaze there was a mix of old tenderness and something more recent, sharper, as if the very memory of the boy had been invaded by something else. That was when Helena noticed a change within herself. Not just fear, not just exhaustion. There was a kind of internal resonance, as if the encounter with that liquid figure, the run along the trail, and the confinement back inside the mansion had triggered a deeper layer of her own memory. Something inside her seemed to be awakening, not something external, but a dormant understanding. She remembered something she had never admitted out loud, not even to herself. On the night of the promise, by the lake, it hadn't been only Raphael who made a vow. She had to, not with words as clear as his, but with the intensity of someone who, in youth, believes that love and eternity are the same thing. She had squeezed his hand tightly, accepted the ring, allowed the pendant to rest against her chest, and, in the moonlight, had formed a silent but unmistakable thought. Neither of us will be forgotten, at any cost. That at any cost had never been translated into concrete actions. But the mansion, the lake, and that presence walking now between the two places seemed to have heard it, and they were collecting. The line between victim and accomplice was starting to blur inside her. Raphael had sought something, yes, but the bond between them was bilateral. Somehow, the strength of the love she had felt intense, youthful, absolute had fueled it just as much as his fear of death. As if in response to that thought, the mansion made a small sound. It wasn't the creak of walls or the rattle of windows. It was the discreet sound of something falling. Helena turned toward the source of the noise. In the center of the room, on the table that had been empty before, there was now an object that hadn't been there when she left. The ring, the same one she had seen sink into the lake. The metal shone with a faint light, as if it had just been polished. It was completely dry despite its impossible origin. Next to it, as if someone had carefully arranged it there, lay Raphael's pendant, the one that, until a moment ago, had been in her pocket. Helena brought a hand to her chest and felt the fabric empty. The object had moved without her conscious action. The two symbols rested side by side, perfectly aligned, as if that were their original position, as if they had always been parts of the same spiritual mechanism. As she drew closer, Helena felt the air vibrate faintly. The buzzing in her head intensified. The room's temperature dropped a little further, but, paradoxically, the tips of her fingers began to tingle, as if a current of energy were gathering there. The lake had given the ring back. The mansion had brought the pendant to join it. It was as if every element of an old pact were being brought together again, piece by piece. Under the watchful gaze of the portrait on the wall and the invisible presence enveloping the house. And now Helena was beginning to grasp something terrible. The return of her first love was not an isolated event. It was the activation of a completed circle, a circle she had never truly left. The voice echoing through the mansion had no clear source. It didn't come from a specific room, nor did it sound like footsteps or natural whispers. It was a voice that seemed to arise simultaneously from within the walls, the floor, and the air itself. A voice speaking in a low, measured tone, reading words that Helena recognized at once. The words from the diary, the same ones she had read in the hidden room behind the bookshelf. But now, something was different. The voice didn't just recite the phrases already written, it seemed to add nuances, inflections, as if the feelings that had once existed only as ink on paper were now gaining texture, intention, and presence. The entire mansion seemed to become the body of that narrative, each wall a page, each shadow a scrap of memory. Helena took a step back, feeling a tremor pass through her chest. It was like hearing Raphael read his own diary, but not a living, human Raphael. It was as if this were a resurrected echo, reconstructed from emotional fragments that had never died. The voice repeated passages she remembered clearly. I feel the house breathing, I feel it watching me, and sometimes, when night falls, I feel that it wants something from me. Helena closed her eyes for a moment, trying to regain her emotional balance. It wasn't easy, because every time a sentence was spoken, it felt like an invisible hand was touching a deep nerve inside her. Each word activated a buried memory, like keys turning in ancient locks within her consciousness. When she opened her eyes, she noticed something that unsettled her even more. The mansion's light was different. The shadows moved with more independence, as if dancing to the rhythm of the voice. The windows seemed to exhale a thin mist, as though breathing in and out. The very air vibrated with an energy she had only felt before in the basement, standing before the ritual circle. Helena knew she couldn't just ignore the voice. It was a summons or a reminder, and, in a way, a warning that the pact begun years ago was being reconfigured, recomposed, demanding her attention. She stepped closer to the table where the ring and pendant lay side by side. An idea, still vague but growing, began to form. These two objects were central parts of the bond between her and Raphael. If they were joined in some way, perhaps they could open or close what was happening. But that didn't necessarily mean anything good. She reached out to touch the pendant, and the instant her fingers brushed the cold metal, the voice inside the house changed tone. It was no longer neutral. It became intimate, and for a few seconds it was exactly Raphael's voice, the human Raphael. With his warm tone, his light breathing, his way of saying her name as if it were a prayer. Helena, she froze. The air seemed to leave her lungs. The voice went on, do you remember what you promised? The silence that followed was almost tangible. She tried to answer, but her throat was dry, closed, as if the mansion were waiting for her response before allowing her to breathe again. The voice returned to whisper, this time closer, more direct. That night, when the world became too small for the two of us, you said you would stay with me, no matter what happened. The full memory of the promise came back, this time with brutal clarity. The high moon, the calm surface of the lake, his hand over hers, the fear, the intensity of young love, and that sentence she never thought had any real power. I'll stay with you, wherever you go. She remembered now. It hadn't been only Raphael who made a pact. She had, too, and she had done it with such deep sincerity that, years later, the promise still seemed to vibrate in her soul strong enough to serve as an anchor for something trying to return. The voice continued, I kept your words, Helena. I kept them like a treasure. Like someone keeps a path to come back. She stepped back, reaching for the far edge of the table to steady herself. The world spun around her. Raphael's portrait above the fireplace seemed to gain depth as the voice spoke. The shadows beneath the frame started to stretch, as if something there were trying to pull itself free from the painting's surface. The feeling that it was watching her not just as a drawing, but as a point of awareness intensified. The voice then read a final line from the diary, a sentence she didn't remember seeing, but it was there now, echoing through the entire house. I will come back to her, even if I have to cross what exists between one life and another. Helena felt a sudden pain in her chest, a stab that spread through her shoulders and up her neck. It was as if an invisible hand was squeezing her heart from the inside. Then, the voice stopped. Silence took over the mansion, but not ordinary silence. It was a full silence, a silence that seemed to wait, that seemed to contain hidden movements within it, a silence that could burst at any moment into sound or into presence. Helena took a few steps back from the table, struggling to breathe. The mansion now felt like a tense organism, waiting for her next decision. That was when she noticed something had changed in the room. The windows were completely dark, not because night had fully fallen, but because a thick fog covered the outer glass. A mist so dense it seemed to press against the panes from the outside in. The house wasn't just watching it, was surrounded. The fog slid along the window frames like watery fingers. And then, almost imperceptibly, a figure began to outline itself within it. Not inside the house, outside, within the fog. At first it was only an outline, a blurred, tall, motionless silhouette. But as the mist shifted, the shape grew sharper. It seemed made of shadow and water at the same time. A body that wasn't solid, but wasn't unreal either. A being that existed exactly on the border between the living and the dead. And even though Helena couldn't see its face, she knew, instantly, it was him, or what was left of him, or what was trying to become him again. The figure didn't move closer to the window, didn't knock, didn't call. It just stayed there, waiting, watching. as if it wanted to see what she would do next. And Helena finally understood that it no longer intended to merely intimidate her or lure her. Whatever was outside wanted something far more specific, a choice. The promise of the past had opened a path. Now she had to decide whether that path would remain open or be cut off, with all the terrible consequences that might bring. The pendant slowly spun on the table, as if guided by a non-existent wind. But there was no wind, no natural movement at all inside the mansion. Helena realized this with a deep shiver. The object was reacting to the environment, it was reacting to her presence, to her breathing, to her remembering, and now it pointed, decisively, toward the front door. The figure wrapped in mist, still motionless outside the window, seemed to wait. It didn't press against the glass, didn't try to get in, it only watched, as if it knew the next decision wasn't its to make, it was hers. The thin line between pursuit and invitation grew ever clearer. The presence didn't want to invade the house. It wanted Helena to leave it, and the house seemed to want the same. The entire mansion was too quiet, like an organism holding its breath, suppressing even the natural creak of its wood. It was as if everything inside were waiting for a single gesture from her, as if it were a page turning slowly, about to reveal the final line of a story written long before she was born. Helena took 3 hesitant steps toward the front door. Each step echoed differently. The first, muffled, the second, drier, the third, almost musical, as if the floor were responding to her with a deliberate sound. It was impossible not to notice. The mansion reacted to her every move. Raphael's portrait, hanging above the fireplace, seemed to watch her with even sharper focus. His eyes had a brightness that didn't belong to paint. It was as if something behind the painting, not paint, nor canvas, nor wood, were following her path toward the door. When she finally stopped before the threshold, she felt the air change. It wasn't just cold, it was dense, almost liquid, as if the hallway were being filled with some invisible substance pressing against her skin. And then she realized, the front door was breathing. The rhythm was subtle, but perceptible. The wood seemed to expand and contract very slowly, like the chest of someone in a deep sleep. The old rusted doorknob gleamed with fresh moisture, as if an invisible hand had held it minutes earlier. As Helena watched, a thought surfaced, clear and inevitable. The door knew who she was. It knew what she had promised, and it knew the time had come to collect. She reached out with a trembling hand and touched the knob. Instantly, a wave of cold ran up her arm, climbing to her shoulder, her neck, the back of her skull. It was as if the house itself were warning her that this gesture would have irreversible consequences. But before she could pull, the voice returned, not from outside, from inside the mansion. A low, dragging voice, as if spoken by someone struggling to breathe. "Don't forget." Helena stepped back, her heart pounding. The sound seemed to come from upstairs, maybe from the bedroom where she'd found the old photo, or perhaps from the hallway where the shadows grew thick. But it wasn't an ordinary whisper. It was a voice carrying particles of the past, as if spoken by someone buried beneath layers of time. The echo finished the sentence. "What you said that night." The memory came back whole now. She saw herself beside Raphael, sitting on the big rock at the lake's edge. The moon reflected on their faces. He held the pendant and the ring as if they were keys to something only he fully understood. And at the height of that youthful emotion, she had said the words that now stood at the center of everything. "I won't let you be alone, not even if the world tries to pull us apart." That night, those words had seemed like nothing more than a declaration of love. But to the lake, to the mansion, to the shadow that existed between worlds, they were something else. They were a pact. Helena's breath caught in her chest. She looked at the door again, and this time, noticed a detail she had missed before. On the floor, right in front of the threshold, there were fine marks, parallel scratches, as if long fingers had slid across the wood, trying to push something in or out. But they weren't just scratches. Between them there was a pattern, curved intertwined lines forming the same symbol stamped on the pendant and on the object found in the basement. It was as if, over the years, someone or something had tried to open the door from the inside, to leave a mark, to record its insistence. Helena knelt down, feeling the cold wood beneath her hands. When she touched the designs, a new memory, or a very old one, exploded inside her. A repressed memory. A memory that hadn't belonged to her conscious thoughts, but now rose up with force. She and Raphael at that same door, many years earlier, on that same night of the promise. They had come down the stairs together, after returning from the lake, still wrapped in the emotion of what they'd said. He held the ring, she held the pendant, and standing at the front door he had said, "If something happens to me, if I don't come back, the house will call you, and you must enter." She remembered now. He had said that, and she had agreed. A pact with the lake, a pact with the mansion, a pact with something deeper than either of them understood at the time. The figure in the fog outside remained still, but the fog around it pulsed softly, as if responding to the memories rising from the depths of Helena's mind. She rose slowly. The entire house watched her, the portrait watched her, the figure watched her, the past watched her. One single thought pulsed inside her mind. Opening the door meant completing the bond. Not opening it meant breaking the pact, and both options had a price. Helena's hand found the doorknob once more, and this time she pulled. The door opened with a long, deep groan, as if waking from a decades-long sleep. The fog entered, not slowly, not violently, but as if it belonged there, sliding across the floor, wrapping around her ankles, climbing her legs, touching her skin like cold fingers of memory. The figure took one step forward. The faint light inside the mansion revealed more details now. The face was almost complete. The expression was indescribable, a mix of pain, longing, and something undefinable, something that did not belong to the world of the living. Then, for the first time, he spoke with a full voice, a sad voice, an ancient voice, a broken voice. "Helena, I came to take you with me." The house held its silence as if it were an altar, and Helena realized the moment before her wasn't just a reunion. It was a summons, a charge, a threshold that, once crossed, would redefine everything she understood about love, death, and promise. The hand extended toward her trembled between form and absence, as if fighting its own nature to remain solid. Behind the figure, the fog twisted, forming fleeting silhouettes, echoes of human shapes that never fully completed themselves. It was as if time itself were trying to rise, to manifest through the memories Helena kept and the ones she tried to forget. But the figure's gaze remained fixed, locked onto her. "Helena, I came to take you with me." The voice carried the cadence of the love she had known, but also the vibration of something beyond it. The entire mansion seemed to tilt toward that sentence, as if absorbing the weight of what was about to happen. Helena felt a subtle tremor in the floor, as if deep roots, the roots of the house, the lake, the memory were shifting beneath her feet, waiting for her decision. She didn't move. For a long moment, she didn't know if it was fear that held her in place, or longing. The air grew colder. The fog crept a few inches farther inside, touching the interior of the mansion with delicacy, almost reverence. And then, for the first time since the presence had appeared, the figure lowered its gaze, as if recognizing her hesitation. Something nearly human crossed his incomplete features. "You promised." Those words pierced Helena deeper than any threat could, because they were true, because they were part of her, because even now, even in the middle of the horror, a deep, terribly human part of her wanted to answer him, wanted to embrace that impossible return, wanted to believe love could walk beyond death. But something new existed in her as well. The awareness of the price, the understanding of the pact, the recognition of what truly stood before her. With trembling hands, Helena picked up the pendant and the ring from the table. They weighed like centuries. When she touched both objects at once, she felt a sudden heat, not human warmth, but the intense heat of ancient forces intertwining, responding to the final call that the bond demanded. The figure lifted its face. The fog behind it rippled. The floor vibrated, and everything, mansion, hillside, lake, memories seemed to converge into that exact second, as if the whole world were holding its breath to witness the outcome of a pact born in innocence. Helena took one step forward. The figure smiled, a sad smile, a broken smile, a smile that seemed to know this would be both a reunion and a farewell. Helena raised the pendant between them, and with a voice that surprised even her with its strength, she said, "I promised I wouldn't leave you alone, but I didn't promise to follow you forever." The fog seemed to shudder. The figure froze not with rigidity, but with pain, a deep, primordial pain that rippled not just through its incomplete body, but through the memory that sustained it. Helena closed her hand tightly around the pendant and the ring, and with a quick, fierce, final gesture, she broke them. The sound wasn't metal snapping. It was something larger, like the distant crack of a spiritual bond torn out by its roots. The figure released a silent scream, without voice, without air, without body. The fog around it writhed violently, forming spirals that unraveled into the air like smoke pulled into an invisible void. The ground shook one last time, deep and low, like the final exhale of something that had existed for far too long. The figure's face began to collapse like water losing its shape, dripping in streams that fell toward the floor and evaporated before touching it. Still, for a brief instant, Helena saw Raphael's true eyes, not the eyes of the rebuilt creature, but the real ones, human, the eyes of the boy she loved. And he whispered this time with a real voice, clean and fragile, "Thank you." Then he vanished. The fog dissolved in seconds, as if it had never existed. The night found its natural silence. The air returned to a normal temperature. The mansion, once a living organism, now looked merely old, truly old, without any presence filling its corridors. Helena fell to her knees. She cried without shame, without restraint, without fear. Cried for the love lost, the love rebuilt, the love that almost consumed her. Cried for Raphael, who had sought eternity too desperately. Cried for herself, for having to break something she once vowed to preserve. And when she finally lifted her head, she realized something important. She was free. The lake, visible through the open door, was still not because it hid secrets, but because it held none anymore. The mansion, silent, seemed to rest. The clocks, once stopped, now marked different times, as if each one had resumed its own life. The promise had finally been ended, not broken-ended, with pain, but with peace. Helena took a deep breath, and for the first time since returning to the hill, she felt she could leave. She crossed the threshold of the front door, not as a victim, but as a survivor. The house didn't protest. The cool night air touched her face like a light, gentle embrace. The path to town seemed less dark now. As she descended the hill, the first lights of Mistvale flickered in the distance, and behind her the mansion remained silent, a different silence, a silence completed.